Some scars aren't wounds, they're memories that refuse to die. The desert of Carthos. 9 smelled like hot metal and dry dust when I first saw her lying there beneath the fading light of 2 distant suns. I was supposed to be cataloging scrap from an abandoned survey outpost. Nothing heroic, nothing dangerous, just another quiet salvage job for a mechanic who preferred broken machines to complicated people. My truck sat about 30 yards behind me, its cooling fans humming softly while the evening wind dragged thin ribbons of red sand across the cracked ground. That's when my scanner chirped. Not a machine, not a reactor core, a heartbeat. Slow, faint, but unmistakably alive. I followed the signal over a ridge of glassy rock until I saw the figure half buried in the sand. At first I thought it was a piece of armor someone had left behind after the last border conflict. But then the armor moved. The figure shifted slightly, the metal plates catching the sunlight like dull silver mirrors, and I realized I was looking at a warrior. She was taller than any human I'd ever seen, easily close to 7 feet, even lying down, her frame wrapped in a suit of alien combat, plating cracked from heat and time. Beneath the fractured armor, I could see glimpses of pale blue skin that shimmered faintly like polished stone. Her hair, long and silver, had spilled across the sand like strands of moonlight. I took a cautious step closer, boots crunching against crystallized dust. The scanner confirmed it again. Alive. Barely. I remember thinking that whoever she was, she didn't belong on a forgotten salvage world 1,200 miles from the nearest settlement. Then her eyes opened. Golden. Bright. Focused. For a moment neither of us moved, the desert wind whispering between us like it was waiting to see who would speak first. Her hand shifted slowly toward the edge of her armor, as if searching for a weapon that wasn't there. I raised both hands instinctively. Easy, I said quietly, my voice sounding small in the open desert. I'm not here to cause trouble. She studied me the way a storm studies the horizon, calm but powerful, as if deciding whether I mattered at all. Up close I could see the damage to her armor more clearly now. Panels warped from intense heat, energy cells drained, the suits. Lights flickering like dying stars. And then I noticed something else. Through the broken chest plate, just beneath the curve of metal, there was a long scar crossing her skin. It wasn't fresh. It looked old, smooth at the edges, almost luminous against the pale blue of her chest. The kind of scar that carried a story. She watched me notice it. Slowly, carefully, she lifted one arm and reached for my wrist with surprising steadiness. Her grip was firm but not hostile, the strength of someone who had survived things far bigger than a desert mechanic. She guided my hand forward until my fingertips hovered inches from the scar. Human, she said, her voice low and calm, carrying a strange musical accent that my translator struggled to smooth out. The wind died completely around us. The desert fell silent. Her golden eyes locked onto mine with unsettling intensity. If you truly want to understand what you found out here, she said softly, touch it. I hesitated for a second longer than I probably should have. The desert wind brushed against the cracked plates of her armor, producing a faint metallic whisper that sounded almost like a warning. Every instinct I had told me this was a bad idea. I was a mechanic, not a medic, not a diplomat, and definitely not the kind of person who understood alien warriors with glowing scars across their chests. But the way she looked at me made it clear that this was not a request. It was a test. Slowly, carefully, I lowered my hand the last inch and let my fingertips touch the smooth line of the scar. The skin felt warm despite the cooling evening air, almost like the metal surface of an engine that had recently been shut down. For a brief moment, nothing happened. I felt the faint rhythm of her breathing beneath the armor fragments, steady but shallow. Then the world tilted. My vision blurred as if someone had suddenly dimmed the desert sun. Colors stretched and twisted at the edges of my sight. It was not pain and it was not fear. It was more like stepping into someone else's memory without warning. The desert around me vanished. Instead, I saw towering shapes of distant cities glowing under unfamiliar skies. Massive starships hung in orbit like silver mountains suspended in darkness. Streams of light moved between them. Like highways in the sky, I could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on someone's shoulders, a presence larger than life, disciplined and unyielding. I realized with a strange clarity that the presence belonged to her. The warrior lying in the sand beside me. The memory shifted again. I saw formations of soldiers standing in perfect order beneath banners that moved slowly in a heavy wind. Their armor reflected distant sunlight in endless rows of polished surfaces. There was pride there, but also exhaustion, the quiet determination of people who had carried too much responsibility for too long. Then the memory faded like a dream, dissolving in morning light. The desert returned. The red sand. The silent horizon. My hand jerked away from the scar, as if I had touched an electric current. I stumbled back a step, heart racing. The alien warrior was watching me closely now, her golden eyes calm, but intensely curious. "You felt it," she said quietly. Her voice sounded almost different now, softer, like someone speaking about a distant storm that had finally passed. I swallowed and tried to steady my breathing. "What was that?" I asked. My voice cracked slightly despite my attempt to stay calm. She shifted against the sand, the damaged plates of her armor scraping faintly as she moved. Even wounded, she carried herself with a kind of quiet authority that filled the empty desert around us. "A memory," she replied. "The echo of a moment that shaped everything that came after." The evening sun had begun to dip below the distant mountains, turning the sky into a deep copper color. Long shadows stretched across the cracked ground like dark rivers. I glanced toward my salvage truck parked about 30 yards away. Its sensors blinked patiently, unaware that the job I had come here for had suddenly become something far stranger. When I looked back at her, the warrior was still studying me with that same unblinking focus. "Most who touch that scar feel nothing," she continued slowly. "But humans are different." Her gaze drifted toward the horizon for a moment, thoughtful, almost distant. Then she returned her attention to me. "Tell me something, Ethan Walker," she said, somehow knowing my name even though I had not spoken it. "Did you see the sky full of ships?" For a moment I could not answer her. The image of that sky still lingered behind my eyes like the afterglow of staring too long at a welding arc ships. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, not drifting like lost satellites, but organized, deliberate, powerful in a way that made my little salvage truck feel like a toy left in the desert. I rubbed the back of my neck, still trying to steady the strange echo that had followed the vision. The alien warrior watched every movement carefully, as if my reaction mattered more than the memory itself. The wind picked up again and carried a long ribbon of red sand across the cracked ground between us. Finally, I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said. "I saw them." Her expression did not change, but something in her posture softened, almost imperceptibly, like a mountain shifting by an inch. "Then the scar recognized you," she said quietly. I frowned at that. "Scars do that where I come from too," I replied. "But usually they just itch when it rains." For the first time since I found her in the sand, the corner of her mouth moved slightly. It was not exactly a smile, but it was close enough that I noticed. The sun continued sinking toward the horizon, turning the desert sky a deeper shade of copper and violet. My truck's external lights switched on automatically, throwing pale beams across the rock formations behind us. I realized I was still standing several feet away from her, as if the distance would somehow make the situation easier to understand. It did not. "You knew my name?" I said after a moment. I definitely did not introduce myself. Her golden eyes reflected the fading sunlight like polished metal. "Your species carries identity patterns within neural resonance," she explained calmly. "When you touched the scar, the connection allowed me to hear it." I stared at her for a second. "You were telling me my name leaked out of my brain because I touched your chest?" "That is a very simplified interpretation," she replied. I exhaled slowly and glanced at the horizon again. Somewhere out there were 1,200 miles of empty desert before the nearest settlement. No roads, no patrols, just wind and silence. Normally I liked it that way. Right now the silence felt different, heavier. I looked back at her armor, the cracked plating and drained power cells. Whatever battle she had come from, it had not ended anywhere near this world. "You are not from around here," I said. "That much I figured out." She shifted slightly, propping herself up on one elbow. Even weakened, the movement carried a disciplined grace that reminded me of trained athletes back on Earth. "No," she said simply. "My people travel far beyond this system." "Well," I muttered, "that explains the sky full of ships." The desert wind rustled again, lifting strands of her silver hair across the broken armor plates. For a long moment she remained silent, studying the distant mountains as if measuring something only she could see. Then she spoke again, her voice lower now. "The ships you saw in the memory were not arriving," she said slowly. "They were leaving." I blinked. "Leaving?" Her gaze returned to me, steady and unflinching. "Yes." The last sunlight slid below the horizon, and the temperature dropped quickly the way it always did on Carthos 9. The desert cooled fast once the sun disappeared. I folded my arms against the chill and watched her carefully. Something about the way she said that word made my stomach tighten. She noticed. Of course she did. Warriors probably spent their entire lives reading small changes in people's faces. "You are wondering why a fleet that large would abandon a battlefield," she said. "Yeah," I admitted. That crossed my mind. She took a slow breath, and for the first time since I found her, there was a hint of something deeper behind her calm expression. Not fear. Not exactly regret. Something older. "Because," she said quietly, "after what happened that day, there was nothing left worth defending." The desert grew colder the moment the sun disappeared behind the jagged mountains, and the wind carried a sharper bite across the open ground. I pulled my jacket tighter while the last traces of copper light faded into deep violet above us. The stars of Carthos 9 began to appear one by one, scattered across the sky like distant sparks from a dying fire. For a while neither of us spoke. The alien warrior remained half-propped against the sand, her breathing slow but controlled, her golden eyes reflecting the rising starlight. I kept thinking about what she had just said. Nothing left worth defending. That was not the kind of sentence someone used casually. "That sounds like a long story," I finally said. My voice carried softly through the quiet desert. She did not answer right away. Instead, she looked up at the sky as if measuring the distance between the stars. After a moment, she lifted one hand and brushed a layer of red dust off the damaged armor on her chest. The cracked plating shifted slightly, revealing the pale blue skin beneath and the long scar that crossed it like a line drawn by lightning. "It is not a short one," she said. I took a few careful steps closer, lowering myself onto a flat rock about 6 feet away so I could keep an eye on her without hovering over her like a nervous medic. My salvage scanner rested beside me on the ground, its small screen still blinking quietly with her faint life signs. "I have got time," I said. "The nearest town is about 1,200 miles away, and my truck is not exactly a racing vehicle." That faint almost smile appeared again on her face, though it vanished as quickly as it came. She studied me the way someone studies an unfamiliar tool, curious about how it works, but cautious about what it might do. "You are an unusual human, Ethan Walker," she said. "Most would have left the moment they realized what I am." I shrugged. Most humans do not spend their evenings in the middle of a salvage desert either. The wind shifted direction, dragging thin lines of sand across the ground between us. I glanced once toward my truck. Its small floodlights continued to cast pale beams across the surrounding rocks, the engine cooling fans humming softly in the distance. Everything about the scene felt strangely peaceful considering how strange the situation had become. When I looked back at her, she had placed one hand lightly over the scar again, her fingers tracing the edge of it as if the mark held its own gravity. "Where I come from," she said slowly. "Warriors are taught that scars are proof of honor." Her voice remained calm, but there was something deeper behind it now. "Each mark tells a story of survival." I nodded. "Back on Earth we usually say something similar. People carry reminders of the hard days they made it through." Her eyes lifted toward me again. "This scar is different." The words were quiet but deliberate. I waited without interrupting. Something told me that whatever she was about to explain mattered more than anything else that had happened today. She took a slow breath and looked once more toward the sky, filled with distant stars. "The fleet you saw in the memory did not leave because they were defeated," she continued. "They left because I gave the order." I felt my eyebrows lift slightly. "You gave the order?" She nodded once. The motion was small but certain. "I commanded that fleet." The wind moved through the broken armor plates again with a low metallic whisper. "And the scar you touched," she said quietly, her gaze steady on mine, "was the moment I realized what that command had truly cost." The desert night settled fully around us, and the temperature dropped fast the way it always did on Carthos 9. The heat of the day vanished like someone had opened a door and let the cold of space leak in. My truck's floodlights cast long pale beams across the cracked ground, while the stars above burned bright and sharp. Out here, far from any city lights, the sky looked endless. I folded my arms against the chill and studied the alien warrior sitting in the sand across from me. She had just said something that would have sounded ridiculous coming from anyone else. But somehow, coming from her, it did not. You commanded all of them, I said slowly. Every ship I saw in that memory. She nodded once. The motion was quiet but certain. Her silver hair shifted slightly in the wind, catching starlight like strands of pale glass. Yes. I leaned back against the rock behind me, letting out a low breath. That is a lot of responsibility. She did not react to the understatement. Her gaze remained steady on the horizon where the last trace of sunset had faded. Responsibility was the purpose of my life, she said. From the moment I was old enough to stand in armor. I glanced down at the scar again. Even in the dim light, it carried a faint glow, almost like the metal edges of a machine that had once been exposed to intense heat. And that moment you mentioned, I said carefully, the one that left the scar. For a second she said nothing. The wind whispered across the open desert, and the distant hum of my truck's cooling system filled the silence. Then she lifted her hand again and rested her fingers lightly over the mark on her chest. The scar is not from an enemy weapon, she said quietly. That caught my attention immediately. I looked up at her face. Her expression was calm, but there was a weight behind her words now that had not been there earlier. Then where did it come from? I asked. She met my eyes directly. From my own armor. I blinked once, unsure if I had heard that correctly. Your armor did that. She nodded slowly. Every commander in our fleets carries an emergency core inside their armor. It is meant to protect the crew and soldiers under their command. Her fingers traced the edge of the scar again, almost thoughtfully. In extreme circumstances, the core can release all of its remaining energy at once. I frowned slightly. That sounds like a last resort. It is, she replied. The wind lifted another ribbon of sand between us. I could see the reflection of my truck's lights moving faintly across the cracked plates of her damaged armor. But you survived, I said. She looked down at the scar again, her golden eyes thoughtful rather than proud. I did not intend to. That answer hung in the air for a moment. I shifted slightly on the rock, trying to understand the quiet certainty in her voice. You mean that explosion? Or whatever the core does, you triggered it yourself. She inclined her head once. Yes. The desert felt even colder suddenly. I stared at her for a long moment, then shook my head slowly. That must have been one bad day. The corner of her mouth moved again in that almost smile I was beginning to recognize. You could say that. She looked back toward the sky, where thousands of stars stretched across the darkness like distant lanterns. The fleet was waiting for my command, she continued softly. Thousands of pilots. Thousands of ships. Entire worlds watching the outcome of that battle. Her gaze returned to me, and in that moment, Ethan Walker, I realized something no warrior ever wants to understand. I raised an eyebrow slightly. What was that? The wind went quiet again, and her voice dropped to a calm whisper that somehow carried farther than the storm ever could. That winning the battle would destroy everything the war was supposed to protect. The wind moved softly across the desert as her words settled into the quiet space between us. Winning the battle would destroy everything the war was supposed to protect. I stared at the cracked sand at my boots for a moment, letting that sentence roll around in my head like a loose bolt in a toolbox. I had spent most of my life fixing broken equipment for mining crews and survey teams across half a dozen frontier worlds, and one thing I had learned early was that people rarely stopped a machine once it started moving. Wars were probably the same way. So you gave the order to leave? I said slowly. She shook her head once. No. Her voice was calm, but there was a heaviness beneath it now, something older than exhaustion. If I had ordered the fleet to withdraw, the war would simply have continued somewhere else. I frowned slightly. Then what exactly did you do? For a moment she did not answer. She lifted her face toward the sky again, and the starlight reflected in her golden eyes like distant embers. The desert had gone completely silent except for the faint hum of my truck and the quiet whisper of sand shifting across stone. Finally she spoke. I ended the battle before either side could win. I leaned forward a little on the rock. That sounds complicated. It was not, she said. It was very simple. Her hand rested lightly over the scar again, almost absent-mindedly, like someone touching an old reminder. My fleet was waiting for my command to advance. The opposing fleet was waiting for my command as well. Both sides believed the next signal would decide everything. I nodded slowly, picturing the scene she had described earlier. Thousands of ships suspended in the darkness, waiting for one person to speak. That is a lot of pressure, I muttered. Yes, she said quietly. But the pressure was not the difficult part. I looked at her. Then what was? The wind shifted again, colder now as the night deepened. She lowered her gaze from the stars and looked directly at me, understanding that both sides believed they were protecting something important. I considered that for a second. And you realized they were both about to lose it anyway. Yes. She spoke the word gently, without anger or pride. Just certainty. I leaned back slightly and let out a slow breath. So, you triggered the emergency core in your armor. She inclined her head once. Correct. I glanced again at the faintly glowing line across her chest. And that ended the battle. It ended the command structure of my fleet, she explained. Without my signal, both sides withdrew to reconsider their strategies. I blinked once, surprised. Wait, that was it. She nodded again. A commander who disappears without explanation creates uncertainty. Uncertainty pauses wars. I let out a short breath of quiet laughter. You are telling me the most advanced fleets in the galaxy stopped fighting because their boss went missing? Yes, she said simply. I shook my head, half amused, half amazed. That might be the strangest peace treaty I have ever heard of. The corner of her mouth moved again slightly. Then the expression faded as she looked down at the scar once more. It did not stop the war forever, she added softly. But it stopped that battle. I followed her gaze for a moment. The faint glow of the scar pulsed gently in the darkness. Still seems like a pretty big sacrifice, I said. You nearly erased yourself just to slow things down. She looked up again, studying my face carefully as if weighing something. I believed it was the only choice left. The wind carried a colder gust across the open desert, rattling a loose panel on my truck in the distance. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she asked quietly, "Tell me something, Ethan Walker." I raised an eyebrow slightly. Sure. Her golden eyes held mine with a strange mixture of curiosity and seriousness. Would a human commander have made the same decision? Her question lingered in the cold night air between us like a signal waiting for a reply. Would a human commander have made the same decision? I rubbed my hands together slowly, more out of habit than warmth, and looked up at the sky for a moment before answering. The stars over Carthos 9 were brutally clear tonight, each one sharp enough to feel almost close enough to touch. I had never commanded a fleet of starships. The closest I had ever come to leadership was telling a mining crew which engine component needed replacing before their transport fell apart halfway across a desert canyon. Still, the question deserved an honest answer. Some would, I said finally. The alien warrior watched me closely, her golden eyes reflecting the pale glow of my truck's floodlights in the distance. And some would not, I continued. Humans are complicated like that. She tilted her head slightly, studying me as if the answer itself was a piece of machinery she was trying to understand. Explain. I shifted on the rock, stretching my legs out across the sand. Back on Earth we have a saying, I said. The hardest choices are the ones where every option costs something important. The wind moved gently across the desert again, brushing thin waves of sand against the broken plates of her armor. Some commanders might push forward, I added. They would believe winning the battle is worth the damage it causes. Others might step back if they realized the victory would leave nothing worth protecting afterward. She considered that quietly. The scar across her chest glowed faintly as the light shifted, almost like it carried its own quiet memory of energy. And you? She asked after a moment. Which choice would you make? I laughed softly under my breath. You are asking the wrong guy. I fix engines and recycle scrap metal for a living. Her gaze did not move. That was not the question. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees. The desert stretched endlessly around us, silent except for the distant hum of my truck and the occasional whisper of shifting sand. Out here there were no crowds, no politics, no admirals shouting orders across command bridges. Just two strangers under a sky full of stars. If I saw that winning meant destroying the reason for the fight, I said slowly, choosing my words carefully, then yeah, I would probably do something crazy to stop it. The alien warrior watched me for another long moment. Then she nodded once, almost thoughtfully. That is what I believed as well. Her voice softened slightly as she spoke, not weaker but more reflective, like someone remembering the shape of a storm after it had already passed. For many cycles I wondered if my decision had been foolish. I shrugged lightly. Every human I know spends at least half their life wondering if they made the wrong decision. The corner of her mouth lifted again in that small, rare expression that was almost a smile. Your species is very strange. That is what everyone says. The wind shifted direction again, and this time it carried a faint mechanical chirp from my truck. I glanced toward it automatically. The long antenna mounted on the roof had rotated slightly, scanning the surrounding terrain like it always did during overnight salvage operations. Normally, it was just routine equipment behavior. Tonight, something about the movement caught my attention. I frowned slightly and reached for the small scanner device beside me, checking the signal readings. The display flickered for a second before stabilizing. A faint energy signature pulsed on the edge of the screen, far beyond the immediate area. I felt my stomach tighten slightly. That is odd, I muttered. The alien warrior noticed the shift in my posture immediately. What is it? I turned the scanner so the dim light from the screen illuminated my face. My equipment just picked up something moving through the upper atmosphere, I said slowly. Her golden eyes lifted toward the sky at once. The stars above us remained calm and silent, but the way she looked at them told me she understood the reading before I even finished speaking. Ethan Walker, she said quietly. Tell me the direction of that signal. I turned the scanner slowly so the screen faced her, the pale green display casting a faint glow across the sand between us. The signal pulsed steadily near the edge of the radar grid, far above the atmosphere, moving with deliberate precision rather than drifting like debris. The alien warrior followed the direction of my gaze and lifted her eyes toward the sky again. The stars still looked calm and distant, but her expression had changed. The quiet curiosity from earlier was gone, replaced by something sharper, something focused. Northwest, I said after checking the compass overlay on the scanner. Roughly 400 miles out and descending slowly. The wind rustled across the desert again, tugging at loose fragments of her damaged armor. She remained perfectly still for several seconds, listening to the silence the way someone listens for thunder before a storm appears. Finally she spoke, her voice low and controlled. That is not a natural object. I gave a small half-smile. Most of the things I find out here are not natural. Last month, I pulled an old cargo drone out of a crater that had been sitting there for 40 years. She shook her head once. This is different. I studied the scanner again. The signal continued to grow slightly stronger with every passing second. You recognize it, I said. It was not really a question. She lowered her gaze from the stars and looked directly at the screen in my hand. The faint glow reflected in her golden eyes. Yes, she said quietly. It is a search vessel. My stomach tightened a little. Searching for what? She did not answer right away. Instead, she slowly pushed herself more upright in the sand, ignoring the faint metallic scrape of damaged armor. Even injured, she carried the posture of someone used to command decks and silent formations of soldiers. For me, she said. The desert seemed to grow even quieter after that. I stared at the scanner again, watching the small blinking point that marked the distant object. You mean your fleet finally came looking for you? Not my fleet, she corrected softly. My people would not search this long. I frowned slightly. Then whose ship is that? She looked back toward the sky once more, her expression thoughtful but alert. There are others who would have reason to track my signal. I considered that for a moment. The faint glow of the scanner reflected across the rock beside me. Let me guess, I said slowly. The side that was not very happy about you ending their battle. She inclined her head once in quiet agreement. I exhaled slowly and leaned back against the rock again. That figures. The wind swept another wave of cold sand across the ground, rattling lightly against the panels of my truck 30 yards away. For a few seconds neither of us spoke, while the small signal on the scanner continued to move steadily closer. Finally I looked back at her. So what happens if they find you here? She held my gaze calmly. They will attempt to retrieve me. I raised an eyebrow. Retrieve you sounds polite. It is a polite word, she replied. I stared at the scanner again. The signal had grown slightly brighter now. How long do we have? She watched the sky carefully, calculating something I could not see. Perhaps 20 minutes before they reached the upper atmosphere. I let out a low whistle under my breath. That is not a lot of time to make a plan. The corner of her mouth lifted faintly again, though this time the expression carried a hint of challenge. Then perhaps, she said quietly, it is fortunate that humans are known for making unusual decisions very quickly. The desert wind moved colder now, slipping between the rocks like a quiet warning that time was running out. I stared at the blinking signal on the scanner for another second before shutting the device off and slipping it into my jacket pocket. Watching it move closer was not going to help us. The alien warrior followed the motion with calm focus, as if she was measuring my reaction more than the approaching ship. 20 minutes, I said quietly. Give or take. She nodded once. Yes. I glanced toward my truck sitting 30 yards away, its floodlights cutting pale tunnels through the darkness. The vehicle was old but reliable, a six-wheeled salvage crawler built for crossing rough terrain at about 30 miles per hour on a good day. It carried spare parts, tools, and enough fuel to drive across 300 miles of empty desert. What it did not carry was anything designed to outrun a spacecraft. You realize that if they are scanning for you from orbit, I said, they will probably notice my truck eventually. She considered that calmly. Eventually, she agreed. But not immediately. I raised an eyebrow. Why not? She shifted slightly in the sand, ignoring the faint grinding sound of damaged armor plates adjusting around her shoulders. Even wounded, she moved with controlled precision. Your vehicle is primitive compared to our technology, she said. It produces very little energy signature. I laughed softly. That might be the nicest thing anyone has ever said about my truck. Her eyes remained serious despite the comment. It gives us a small advantage. I studied her carefully for a moment. You said they want to retrieve you, I said. That sounds like you are important. She did not respond immediately. The wind tugged lightly at her silver hair as she looked toward the horizon again, calculating something beyond my understanding. To some, she said finally, I am unfinished business. That answer did not make me feel better. I stood up from the rock slowly and stretched my legs, brushing sand off my pants. The cold night air bit through my jacket as I walked a few steps toward the truck and looked back at her. Can you move? She followed my gaze toward the vehicle, and then back to me. For a moment, she seemed to measure the distance, the terrain, the remaining strength in her body. Then she placed one hand against the ground and pushed herself upright. The movement was slow but steady. The damaged armor scraped quietly as she rose to her full height, towering over the desert rocks by nearly a foot. Even injured, she looked like something carved from starlight and steel. Yes, she said. I nodded once. Good. I turned and started walking toward the truck, expecting her to follow. The floodlights grew brighter as we approached, illuminating the scratched metal panels and tool racks mounted along the sides. When we reached the vehicle, I opened the passenger door and pulled down the small folding step. Climb in, I said. She paused beside the truck, studying the machine with curiosity. Her fingers brushed lightly along the edge of the door frame, as if she were examining a strange artifact from another world. This vehicle will help us escape. Escape might be an optimistic word, I replied as I climbed into the driver's seat. But it will help us move. She stepped inside carefully, folding herself into the passenger space with surprising grace for someone nearly 7 feet tall. The suspension creaked slightly under the extra weight. I started the engine and the crawler came to life with a deep mechanical hum. As the dashboard lights flickered on, I glanced up through the windshield toward the sky. For a second, everything looked the same. Endless stars. Empty darkness. Then I saw it. A faint moving light crossing the upper atmosphere like a silent comet. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Looks like your friends just arrived early. I eased the salvage crawler forward, and the 6 heavy wheels rolled across the red sand with a low grinding hum. The headlights cut a pale tunnel through the desert darkness, while the engine vibrated beneath my boots like an old animal waking up. Beside me, the alien warrior sat surprisingly still, her golden eyes fixed on the windshield, as the faint moving light above us slid silently across the sky. The object was brighter now, no longer just a distant spark, but a steady silver glow gliding through the upper atmosphere. It moved too smoothly to be natural and too precisely to be random debris. I pushed the throttle slightly, and the crawler climbed over a ridge of cracked stone at a careful 30 miles per hour. Not fast by any standard, but out here speed was less important than not breaking an axle in the middle of nowhere. The wind rushed past the truck in soft waves, carrying sand against the metal panels with a dry whisper. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then the warrior leaned slightly closer to the windshield, studying the moving light with calm concentration. "They are scanning," she said quietly. I kept my eyes on the road ahead while adjusting the navigation panel. "How can you tell?" "The vessel is slowing its descent in stages," she replied. "It is mapping the surface before committing to a landing approach." I nodded slowly. That matched what my scanner had suggested earlier. Whoever was up there wanted to find something specific, and that something was sitting in the passenger seat of my truck. "Any chance they cannot see us down here?" I asked. She considered the question for a moment. "Your vehicle produces a minimal energy profile. Against the background radiation of this planet, it will appear insignificant." I gave a small breath of relief. "So we look like a rock." "For now," she said. That phrase did not sound comforting. The crawler bounced slightly as the wheels crossed a shallow ridge of hardened sand. I steered us toward a line of dark hills about half a mile ahead where the terrain dipped into a narrow canyon system. If we could reach the rocks before that ship finished scanning the open desert, we might buy ourselves a little more time. The warrior noticed the direction change immediately. "You are heading for the canyon." "Natural cover," I replied. "Rocks block sensors. At least the basic ones." Her gaze shifted toward the approaching hills, and she nodded once in approval. "A reasonable strategy." I chuckled quietly. "Do not sound so surprised." Above us the silver light grew brighter for a moment before drifting behind a thin band of clouds high in the atmosphere. Even hidden, I could still feel its presence the way you feel distant thunder long before a storm arrives. The crawler rolled down a shallow slope, and the dark shapes of the canyon walls began to rise on both sides of the horizon. My headlights reflected off the stone like pale mirrors. "Once we are inside the canyon," I said, "their scanners will have trouble locking onto us unless they get very close." The warrior studied the rocks ahead carefully. "That will give us time." I glanced sideways at her. "Time for what?" She turned her golden eyes toward me, calm but purposeful. "Time for me to decide whether I will allow them to find us." I blinked once in confusion. Allow them? Her expression remained steady as the crawler rumbled deeper into the approaching canyon shadows. "Yes, Ethan Walker," she said quietly. "Because if they believe I am still alive, they will not stop searching until they see the truth with their own eyes." The crawler rolled deeper into the canyon, and the desert wind faded into a distant whisper behind the tall rock walls. The headlights bounced off layers of ancient stone that had been carved by centuries of storms, creating narrow corridors of shadow and pale light. I slowed the vehicle to about 20 miles per hour as the ground grew rougher, carefully guiding the 6 wheels over uneven ridges of sand and broken rock. The alien warrior sat beside me, without speaking for several seconds, her attention shifting between the canyon walls and the sky that was now only a thin ribbon of stars above us. Her earlier words echoed in my mind. "Allow them to find us." That did not sound like someone who was simply trying to hide. "You said something back there that I did not quite understand," I said finally, keeping my voice calm as the crawler bounced gently over a rocky dip. "You said you might allow them to find us." She turned her head slightly, studying me with that steady golden gaze that never seemed hurried or uncertain. "Yes," she said. "I did." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and steered the truck around a narrow bend in the canyon floor. "Most people in your situation would probably prefer the opposite. Most people are not responsible for the outcome of an interstellar war," she replied quietly. I let out a slow breath through my nose. "Fair point." The canyon grew darker as the walls rose higher around us. My headlights illuminated layers of rock that looked almost black under the night sky. For a few seconds, the only sound inside the truck was the steady rumble of the engine and the soft rattle of tools in the storage rack behind the seats. Then she spoke again. "If the search vessel confirms my survival," she said, "the commanders who sent it will assume something very important." I glanced sideways at her. "That you are still capable of making decisions." She nodded once. "Exactly. I considered that while guiding the crawler across another patch of uneven ground. And that makes them nervous." "Yes." I laughed quietly under my breath. "Good. Nervous leaders sometimes make careful choices." She watched me thoughtfully. "You believe caution is beneficial. I believe people slow down when they are not sure what the other side might do next." The canyon floor began to slope downward, opening into a wider basin of scattered rock formations. I reduced speed again to about 15 miles per hour. Above us, the ribbon of sky remained calm, but the faint silver glow of the search vessel was occasionally visible when the canyon widened enough for a clear view upward. It had begun circling now rather than descending directly. "They are adjusting their scan pattern," she said quietly. "They have noticed something unusual." I glanced up through the windshield. "Us?" "Possibly," she replied. "Or the energy residue from my armor core." I frowned slightly. "That scar again." Her hand moved lightly to the glowing mark across her chest, almost unconsciously. "It carries a signature that advanced sensors can detect if they look carefully enough." The crawler rolled into the basin, and I guided it behind a cluster of tall stone pillars that cast deep shadows across the ground. I eased off the throttle, and the engine dropped into a low idle. For a moment the truck simply sat there, half hidden in darkness. The alien warrior watched the sky through the windshield with calm focus. Then she turned toward me again. "Ethan Walker," she said softly, "if the search vessel sends a landing team into this canyon, I will need your help with something." I raised an eyebrow slightly. "You already have my truck." The corner of her mouth lifted faintly again. "What I need is not transportation." I leaned back in the seat slightly. "Then what do you need?" She looked toward the faint glow of her scar for a moment before meeting my eyes again. "I need a human to do something that my own soldiers would never believe possible." The canyon basin remained silent, except for the quiet idle of the crawler's engine and the distant whisper of wind sliding along the stone pillars around us. I leaned back slightly in the driver's seat and studied the alien warrior carefully. Her golden eyes were steady, patient, like someone waiting for a reaction she already expected. "All right," I said slowly. "You definitely have my attention." Outside the windshield, the faint silver glow in the sky moved again, tracing a slow circle above the canyon walls. The search vessel was no longer just passing overhead. It was studying the terrain. I could almost imagine the sensors sweeping the rocks, searching for something that did not belong. The warrior followed my gaze upward for a moment before looking back at me. "My people believe humans are physically fragile," she said quietly. "Compared to most species in the galaxy, that assumption is correct." I shrugged slightly. "You are not wrong." She tilted her head a fraction, the silver strands of her hair catching the dim dashboard light. "However, there is something about humans that many commanders underestimate." I waited, tapping the steering wheel lightly with my fingers. "And that is?" Her eyes flicked briefly toward the faint glow of the scar on her chest before returning to my face. "Your species has an unusual relationship with fear." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean we panic a lot?" The corner of her mouth moved slightly again. "No," she said softly. "You continue moving even when you know you should probably run." I thought about that for a moment and then nodded slowly. "Yeah, that sounds about right." The search vessel above us shifted its pattern again. A faint band of pale light moved across the canyon rim, scanning the rocks like a silent lighthouse beam. It was still far away, but slowly closing the distance. The warrior watched it carefully. "If they send a landing craft into this canyon," she said, "they will expect to find me alone and weakened." I frowned slightly. "You are both of those things." "Yes," she replied calmly, "but they will not expect a human to interfere." I folded my arms and leaned back in the seat. "Interfere how exactly?" She looked directly at me again. "When they approach, they will attempt to confirm my identity through the energy signature of the scar you touched earlier." I glanced down at the faint glow. Across her chest. "That thing again?" "Yes." Her voice remained calm but precise. "The scar is connected to the emergency core that once powered my armor. Even now it holds a small residual charge." I nodded slowly, beginning to see the direction she was heading. "And you want me to do something with it?" "Correct." She leaned slightly closer, her voice lowering just enough that it felt more like a quiet plan than a command. "When the landing team scans the scar, they will expect the signal to match the original commander profile that ended the battle years ago." "Which is you?" I said. "Yes." She paused briefly, watching my reaction. "But if a human touches the scar again at the exact moment their sensors are active, the signal will distort." I blinked once. "Distort how?" Her golden eyes held mine steadily. "It will appear as if the energy signature has partially merged with yours." I stared at her for a second before letting out a short laugh of disbelief. You were telling me you want their scanners to think a human mechanic somehow bonded with an alien fleet commander. Yes, she said simply. I shook my head slowly. That sounds like the kind of story nobody in their right mind would believe. She nodded once. Exactly. Outside the canyon, a faint beam of scanning light swept across the upper rock wall again, brighter now than before. The search vessel had clearly found something interesting. The warrior looked back toward the sky, then toward me again. And when commanders encounter something they cannot explain, she said quietly, they hesitate. The scanning beam from the vessel above the canyon swept across the rock wall again, brighter now, the pale light sliding down the stone pillars like a slow tide. Inside the crawler, the engine idled quietly, the steady vibration humming through the metal frame beneath my boots. I looked from the moving light outside the windshield back to the alien warrior beside me. Her expression remained calm, but the focus in her golden eyes had sharpened into something precise and determined. So the plan, I said slowly, is that I touch the scar again when their scanners activate. She nodded once. Yes. The faint glow across her chest pulsed softly in the dim cabin light. I exhaled through my nose and leaned back slightly in the seat. You realize that if this works, somewhere up there a group of very confused commanders are going to think a human mechanic is connected to a legendary alien fleet commander. That is the intention, she replied quietly. Outside the canyon, the search vessel's light shifted again. This time the beam lingered longer along the canyon rim, sweeping across the rock formations like a careful hand searching for a hidden door. The ship was getting closer. I reached over and shut off the crawler's headlights, letting the vehicle disappear deeper into the shadows of the stone pillars. The cabin grew darker, lit only by the faint dashboard glow and the soft blue pulse from the scar across her chest. For a moment we both watched the sky through the windshield. The silver shape of the vessel finally appeared above the canyon rim, a distant silhouette gliding slowly across the stars. It did not roar like human aircraft. It moved in silence, smooth and controlled, like a thought drifting through the night. They are preparing a surface scan, she said quietly. I nodded and rested my hands on the steering wheel. Then we should probably give them something interesting to look at. She turned toward me and gently moved the broken armor plate aside, revealing the full length of the glowing scar. Up close the mark looked less like a wound and more like a thin line of captured lightning resting against her blue skin. The glow brightened slightly, as if responding to the approaching sensors in the sky. When the scan begins, she said softly, place your hand exactly where you did before. I studied the mark for a moment, remembering the strange vision that had filled my mind the first time I touched it. Starships, fleets, the weight of decisions larger than worlds. Then I nodded once. All right. Above us the search vessel stopped moving. A faint column of pale light descended slowly from the sky and spread across the canyon floor like a silent spotlight. The beam touched the stone pillars, the sand, the shadowed shape of my crawler. The warrior looked up into the light, calm and unafraid. Now, she said. I reached out and placed my hand gently against the glowing scar. Instantly the warmth returned beneath my fingertips, and the strange resonance hummed softly through my chest. The beam from the ship brightened as its sensors locked onto the energy signature. For several seconds nothing else moved. The canyon held its breath. Then the light flickered slightly, as if the instruments above were suddenly unsure of what they were seeing. I felt the vibration change beneath my hand as the scar's faint glow merged with the rhythm of my own heartbeat. The alien warrior watched the sky carefully, waiting. High above us the search vessel hesitated. Its scanning beam shifted, recalibrated, and then paused again in visible confusion. I let out a quiet breath and glanced sideways at her. Looks like your theory about hesitation was correct. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly in the dim light. She kept her eyes on the sky for another moment before speaking softly. Yes, Ethan Walker. The vessel slowly lifted higher into the atmosphere, its scanning beam fading as the silver shape began to drift away from the canyon. Only after it had become a distant star again did she finally relax her shoulders. The scar beneath my hand dimmed gently. She looked at me then, the faint almost smile returning to her face. It appears, she said quietly, that your species has just confused an interstellar fleet. I withdrew my hand slowly and leaned back in the seat, watching the quiet sky return to normal. The desert wind moved softly through the canyon again. Somewhere far above us, the search vessel continued its slow retreat into the darkness. And for the first time that night, the stars looked peaceful again.